Hello and welcome to Catholic Answers Live. So glad you could all join us for 2 hours today of Ask Me Anything. That's right, ask us anything you want on Catholic Answers Live today. So pick up the phone and dial 888-318-7884 if you have a question about the Catholic faith, about the Catholic Church, Catholic beliefs, Christian beliefs, anything you want to ask us. 888-318-7884 is the number to call. You may have noticed this is not the voice of Cy Kellett. He is on his way back from a conference in North Dakota with our friends at a banquet, with our friends at Real Presence Radio. We love the work they do and the many radio stations that broadcast this show for us. And he just got finished doing a little speaking gig there. And he's on his way back now from North Dakota. But in the meantime, I'm taking you home on this Friday. Thomas Graff, social media manager here at Catholic Answers, filling in for Cy Kellett. And once again, the number to call if you want to ask us anything is 888-318-7884. Answering your questions, most of you know him, I think, is our senior apologist, author, speaker, podcaster now of, I lost track of how many podcasts he has. It's Jimmy Akin. Howdy, Jimmy. Thanks for coming back.
Howdy, no problem. These days I'm regularly appearing on 6 podcasts.
That is tremendous work.
Weekly.
Yeah. And still finding time to give us 2 hours. I guess that's one of the podcasts, but nevertheless, still quite the busy man, Jimmy Akin. Thanks so much for joining us again. And
my pleasure.
Yeah, and one of the podcasts, of course, that we all know very well by now, it's Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. That has a new episode that drops every single Friday where Jimmy talks about whatever mysterious, weird, unsolved, or quasi-solved mysteries that he cares to talk about. And Jimmy, what mysteries will you be pondering on this week's episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World?
Well, just recently, the church finally arrived at a judgment on the reported apparitions in Medjugorje, and people have been wanting and asking for years for me to do a treatment of Medjugorje. And now that we finally got a ruling, I decided to dig into them. So this month, we've got a 3-part look at Medjugorje. Today's episode, I talk about the events of the apparitions and to provide the background for them. Next week, we look at the church's official judgment. And then for the climax of it all, for the 3rd week, I do my own analysis and tell you what my conclusions are.
Fascinating. I know that's a rich, deep story that goes back several decades that the first reported apparitions began? Yeah,
1981.
A lot of controversy surrounded that for a long time, but it's nice that we finally got a Vatican ruling, and now we can really start to plumb the depths within those confines. And the other podcast that Jimmy Akin has just recently launched in the last couple months here for Catholic Answers is the Jimmy Akin Podcast, The Mysteries of the Faith. And that has new episodes every Monday. Is that correct, Jimmy?
Yes, that's correct.
That's right. And what is coming up this coming Monday?
Well, in terms of what's out there right now, what came out this Monday, it was a look at dialogue in the Bible, because people have a tendency whenever they see someone quoted in the Bible, whether it's Jesus or someone else, to assume that this was exactly the words that the person used. And ancient authors, because they didn't have tape recorders and they didn't have stenographers all over the place, they weren't expecting exact quotations. They expected people to give you the gist of what was said, but not a word for word quotation. And there are actually ways to show that the Gospels are using that more flexible standard. They're conveying the gist, but not the exact words of the people that are being quoted. One of the ways of showing that is by comparing accounts of the same events in different Gospels and noticing how the words are a little different. So this week we have an episode on reconstructed dialogue in the Bible. You asked what's coming up next week, and that is going to be a very common question. Next Monday is a very common question I get. I've answered it a lot on Catholic Answers Live, and so I decided to create a resource to point people to. And that question is, do we leave time when we die? Because people have this idea, God's outside of time. We go to be with God when we die. Therefore, we must go outside of time. And that is actually 100% not true. And so I'm going to talk all about that on Monday.
That's the Jimmy Akin Podcast, available, I believe, almost everywhere you can listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, our own website, Catholic.com. And so check out those episodes. And not too big of a backlog if you want to work through all of the episodes that Jimmy has made so far. That's the Jimmy Akin Podcast, The Mysteries of the Faith. Meanwhile, the other podcast that Jimmy appears on regularly, this one, Catholic Answers Live, we have full lines here. So, Jimmy, if you're game, we will go right out to the phones. Let's start with our friend Luke in Seoul, South Korea, listening on Catholic Answers Live app. Thanks for downloading the app, Luke. Welcome back to the show.
Hello, Joe. Hello, Sai, and Edgar, Jimmy. Good morning.
Patty, 안녕하세요.
안녕하세요, Jimmy. That's all right. So, Jimmy, my question for you today is John 14, verse 6. No one goes to the Father except through me. What impact does this have on those who have a different religious backgrounds, maybe those that haven't had the opportunity to hear or know about our Lord Jesus? I mean, does the source have a teaching on this? Thank you.
Yes. So, and I suspect you already know what it is. What does the church teach about the possibility of salvation of non-Catholics? Does it hold that's possible or impossible?
Oh, it's possible.
Okay, so we've got our answer. So it is possible for people who don't know about Jesus to be saved. And as a prime example of that, I would point to King David. King David was someone who did not know about Jesus. He didn't know that, I mean, he's the prototype of the Messiah. So there were not yet any explicit prophecies about one day there's going to be a Messiah, much less did King David have the knowledge that Jesus is going to be the Messiah. So since Jesus says that he's the way, the truth, and the life, and no one goes to the Father but through him, and since David went to the Father, you know, he's among the saved, and since he didn't know about Jesus, we must conclude that King David went to the Father without knowing about Jesus, but still through Jesus. So Jesus is the only way anybody gets saved, but you don't necessarily have to know about Jesus to be saved through him. If you don't know about Jesus through no fault of your own, like King David himself, then God's not going to hold that against you, and you can still be saved through Jesus as long as you otherwise live up to whatever degree of light and grace God has given you.
Luke, thanks so much for that question. We always love it when you call from South Korea. Don't hesitate to call again soon. Let's now go to Orlando calling from Puerto Rico, and he's tuning in on YouTube. Orlando, welcome to the show. You're on the air.
Hi, Jimmy, and thank you. I'm trying to go through your book, Teaching with Authority, and it's answering a lot of my questions. So thank you for writing that. So my question is regarding civil marriages. Are as Catholics or general Christians, are they bound to follow, let's say, general marriage rules about just general loyalty and just what the Bible talks about marriage? And I asked that specific question because I've encountered Catholics use the excuse that, they were not married by the church, so they can basically do whatever they want, or they can just get divorced because of any excuse or be unfaithful. So what is the position of the church regarding civil marriages in general?
Okay, so the Catholic Church only requires that its own citizens, meaning Catholics, get married in the church under ordinary circumstances. This is not a requirement of people who are not Catholic. So if you have two people who are Catholic, or at least one of them is Catholic, and they get married in a civil marriage outside of the church, without special circumstances applying, then that's not going to be a legitimate marriage. And in fact, they should not be acting as if they're married, because they're not. So, of course, that doesn't mean they're free to sleep with whoever, because you're only supposed to sleep with people you're married to. And if you're not married to anybody, you shouldn't be sleeping with anybody. So the idea, oh, well, we got a civil marriage as Catholics and therefore we're not obliged to be faithful to each other is true, but that doesn't give you're not obliged to be faithful to each other, but you are obliged to live chastely because you're not married, and the way of being chaste if you're not married is by not sleeping with anybody. So this doesn't justify that behavior. Now, I mentioned that this applies to Catholics because if you have two non-Catholics who get married in a civil ceremony, neither of them is bound by Catholic law, and therefore their marriage is going to be presumptively valid, and they should be acting as if they're really married because the presumption is they really are married.
Sound good, Orlando?
I see. Yeah, that's very good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for your call, Orlando. Hope that was helpful. We've got to take a quick break real quick here. But before we do, I just want to remind everyone that our new calendar for 2025 is out, the Catholic Answers Sacred Art Calendar. And if you haven't heard already, this is a really incredibly unique collection of sacred art for the modern age. So we got a bunch of current contemporary Catholic artists to contribute their own original works to this. And on the notes here, it says I have to read a calendar factoid, and that's going to be about January's artist, who his name is Martin Earl from Great Britain. And if you can see if you're watching on the stream, this is what he made for the month of January. It's the Adoration of the Magi. He carved this. This is a polychromed altar frontal titled Adoration. He carved it from oak for St. John the Forerunner in Austin, Texas. And so this is this is January. This is what you're getting for the first month. Is it, folks? Yeah, this is what you're getting for the first month with this sacred art calendar. And as well as carving in wood and stone, Martin paints in egg, tempera, and gilt. People who know art are going to know what that means. I don't. Makes mosaics and creates...
Covered in gold.
Oh, very cool. Okay, that's way cooler than gilt. Egg, tempera, and covered in gold. He makes mosaics and he creates designs for other makers to execute. Martin Earl. So again, if you see this... If you order this calendar and you see this art, you're going to be blown away, not just by Martin's designs, but all the rest of them for the rest of the months on here. How do you get it? You go to Catholic.com, click on the bright orange banner at the top of the page. You can't miss it. It says, get your 2025 Catholic Answers calendar today. You go right there, and it'll take you to the page where you can order yours. Catholic.com, get the Catholic Answers calendar, and don't go anywhere because we will be right back after this.
Catch Catholic Answers live anytime at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Are you a coffee drinker? If so, you can now enjoy a coffee roasted to perfection by the Carmelite monks of Wyoming. Delicious Mystic Monk coffee is roasted and prepared by monks in a hidden cloistered monastery and is available in over 25 varieties. All Mystic Monk coffees are works of perfection and labors of love. For more information on how to purchase Mystic Monk coffee, visit mysticmonkcoffee.com. That's mysticmonkcoffee.com.
EWTN is everywhere. EWTN radio programming is provided free of charge to over 500 domestic and international AM and FM radio stations. It's a great teaching tool for Catholics and non-Catholics alike. For a complete list of EWTN AM and FM stations across America, visit EWTNradio.net. At the bottom of the page, click Affiliates. EWTN is the global Catholic network.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Thomas Graff, social media manager here at Catholic Answers, filling in for the normal host, Cy Kellett, who's on his way back from North Dakota. He'll be back with you on Monday. For now, I'm taking you home on Friday with Ask Me Anything, featuring our very own Jimmy Akin, who is taking your calls. If you want to call in with a question, the number to call is 888-318-7884, although all the lines are full right now, but keep on calling, because as we get through questions, people will drop, and that is your opportunity. We're going to go now to Matt, calling from Alabama and watching on YouTube. Matt, welcome to Catholic Answers Live. What's your question for Jimmy?
Hey, Jimmy, how are you doing?
Doing just fine.
Yes, I just wanted to call and ask. I know someone who was recently told by a teacher that they don't have to believe that Adam and Eve were like real people historically, and that it can be interpreted that they're just allegorical persons. And I was just curious if there's any teachings on whether that is a licit position or not.
There is not a teaching on this. There was a regulation on this, but it has since been modified. In 1950, Pope Pius XII issued an encyclical called Humanae Generis, which dealt with a variety of issues, and one of them was the issue of human evolution. And Pope Pius said that there's no problem believing in human evolution so long as you maintain certain requirements, like it happened under God's providence, and God created the souls of the first people and stuff like that. But then he turned to the question of whether Adam and Eve were the only two people at the beginning of the human race. That position is known as monogenism. The alternative to monogenism is known as polygenism. Polygenism would hold that there was more than just two people at the beginning of the human race. And he said that Catholics did not have the liberty, so this is not a teaching but a regulation, because he's not using the language of teaching. He's not saying the church teaches that that there were only two people. He says the Catholics don't have the liberty, so that's the language of regulation, to propose polygenism, because it is not clear how to square that with Scripture and the Church's teachings about original sin. And so what that had the effect of doing was focusing theological attention on, are there ways to square polygenism with what Scripture and the Church have taught about original sin. And so theologians got busy thinking of models that could reconcile the two. And by 1967, I want to say, the Vatican newspaper itself, L'Osservatore Romano, was printing articles explaining, here's how we could reconcile them. One model held that Adam and Eve were real historical individuals, but they were part of a broader population. So they would be like the heads and the theologically significant members of a broader population of humans. And so when they fell, everybody fell. Another model was the one that you just mentioned, which is Adam and Eve are symbols of the broader population, which could be suggested by their names, because Adam in Hebrew means man or mankind, and Eve or Chava means life, because that's even pointed out in the text of Genesis itself. So if you have these first humans named mankind and life, it's easy to see how they might be symbols of whatever original humans existed. And then mankind and all the living fell away from God in the act of original sin, and that's been passed down to us. So you had that being proposed in the Vatican's own newspaper in 1967. And subsequently, I won't go through all the stages of development, but subsequently you had greater and greater recognition of this as a possibility. There were various national catechisms that got, in particular nations, that got published by bishops' conferences that talked about this as a possibility. And in 2002, the International Theological Commission, which is an advisory body run by the then Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome, published a document called Communion and Stewardship that dealt with the image of God in man. And it was open. It openly talked about the possibility of Adam being a symbol of early mankind, and it referred to both the possibility that the human race began with individuals, or that it began with populations, which is the standard scientific account. And the International Theological Commission is only allowed to publish its documents on the provision that the magisterium does not have any problem with them. And since Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict, authorized the publication of this document. That signals that the magisterium doesn't have a problem with this concept. And if you look at more recent works, like another head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Gerhard Muller, in his book on Catholic dogmatics, he also talks about this is not a dogma of the faith. It's something where there's flexibility. So if you want to believe that Adam and Eve were two individuals and they were the only ones that existed, you're welcome to believe that. If you want to believe that they were two individuals in a broader population, the church permits that. And if you want to believe that they were symbols of the early human population, you're permitted to believe that as well.
Matt, thanks so much for your question. We're going to keep moving right along because the lines are full. We're going to go to Rory in Eastern Pennsylvania, listening on the Catholic Answers Live app. Rory, thanks for downloading the app on your phone. What is your question for Jimmy?
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So I was wondering why only a baptized or a baptized person or a person in the state of grace can merit anything, and then also how you'd answer the atheist objection that God is bad because he would send an unbaptized but otherwise good person to hell.
Okay. Well, in regard to the first, so let me make sure I got the first question down. Why does one need to be baptized or in a state of grace to merit something? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Well, one needs to be in a state of grace to merit something because the fundamental principle of merit is the theological virtue of love, also known as charity. Unless you're doing something out of charity, it's not meritorious. God does not promise to reward it. That's what something meritorious is, something that God has promised to reward. So the doctrine of merits is the same as the doctrine of rewards. God has promised to reward things that are done out of charity, which is supernatural love of God and neighbor, but not out of other forms of love or not out of other motives. We see this, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, if all you do is greet your brothers, what reward are you going to get? Even the pagans do that. Even they love people who love them. What you need to do is be like God and love everybody. And so if you do acts of love for people who are, for people in general, not just because they love you, that's the kind of love that God will reward. Now, in terms of baptism is charity is infused into our hearts at baptism, and baptism is the ordinary way that we get supernatural love, but it is not exclusive to baptism. God can give people the grace of charity apart from baptism. As St. Augustine said, we are bound by the sacraments, but God is not. So it is possible for someone to acquire charity and thus be in a state of grace and thus merit things, even if they haven't been baptized. When it comes to the second question of how would I answer an atheist who says God is bad because he'll send people to hell, even if they're otherwise good, I'd say, well, the church agrees with you. God is not going to do that. It would be bad if someone was good in a state of grace, having supernatural charity, and God just said, sorry, you're not baptized, you're going to hell. That is not what the church believes. The church believes, as we covered in a previous call, that if someone doesn't know about God or doesn't believe in God through no fault of their own, and they otherwise live up to whatever degree of light and grace they have in their lives, then it is possible for them to be saved, whether they're baptized or not. So baptism is not an absolute requirement. It's the normal way that we get saved, and it's the way God wants us to approach him. But if someone is innocently unaware of that fact, God's not going to hold it against them.
Rory, does that help you out?
Yes. Could I ask one very short follow-on?
Really quick.
Yeah.
Okay, so then could an atheist or a non-believer be in a state of grace without knowing it?
Yes, and that's implied by what I just said. If someone, I didn't say anything about what they, I mean, I was talking about unbelievers, people who don't know about or don't believe in God or don't believe in Jesus through no fault of their own. If it's through no fault of their own, if they otherwise live up to the degree of light and grace they do have, then they will be in a state of grace, and it's possible for them to be saved.
All right, Rory, thank you so much for those questions. Thanks for calling. Do call back again. That's going to open up another line for us. If you want to hop on and ask Jimmy Akin a question, the number to call is 888-318-7884. That's 888-318-7884. My name is Thomas Graff. I am the social media manager normally here at Catholic Answers, but I am filling in for Cy Kellett as he is on his way back from a speaking engagement in North Dakota. He's going to be back with you on Monday. As I said, Jimmy Akin is our guest, and we are just about halfway through this hour of Catholic Answers Live, of Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. Once again, 888-318-7884 is the number to call, and we will be right back with more Ask Me Anything right after this.
We hope that one of the things that we communicate here at Catholic Answers Live is that our Catholic faith allows us to be fully serious about all the problems we encounter in the church and in the world, but it also lets us have light hearts and maybe even mix in a bit of fun, and that is exactly what our good friend Joe Heschmeyer does in his popular podcast, Shameless Popery. You should check it out at shamelessjoe.com. Joe's got a deep grasp of the faith, morals, the teachings of the church, all that, but he's also got a witty conversational style. He entertains and he informs, but you will leave equipped to better answer the most common challenges, misconceptions, and questions about the Catholic faith. He's got insightful guests, he does on-air debates, and he takes a close look into all the things that you want to know about as a Catholic living today. You'll walk away knowledgeable and filled with joy. Look for Joe on his YouTube channel. Check him out at shamelessjoe.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, become a patron.
Deepen your connection to the Church's holy days and seasons while you draw on the wisdom of the Church Fathers. Feasts of Our Fathers, the new book from Mike Aquilina and Adam Lucas, is a treasury of history, prayers, insights, and lessons that will bring you closer to the earliest of Catholic traditions. Take your prayer life and your solidarity with the Church, past and present, to a new level. Order your copy of Feasts of Our Fathers today at shop.catholic.com.
When the resurrected Jesus appeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, they didn't recognize him until the breaking of the bread. The same is true today. In the Holy Eucharist, we really meet Jesus. In The Eucharist is Really Jesus, author Joe Heschmeyer explains how knowing Jesus in the Eucharist is the key to understanding all of Christian faith. Order your copy of The Eucharist is Really Jesus today at shop.catholic.com or get it at a good Catholic bookstore.
There's the groovy music. You know what that means. We are halfway through the hour with Jimmy Akin here on a Friday doing Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. As I said, Thomas Graff, social media manager, normally here at Catholic Answers, filling in for Cy Kellett, who will be back with you on Monday. And for now, we are still taking your questions about anything you like, answered by Jimmy Akin, our senior apologist. And Jimmy, we're going to go now to Houston, Texas, where Nancy is listening on the EWTN app. Nancy, go ahead with your question for Jimmy.
Hey, Jimmy. First, I want to thank you so much. I mean, you guys have taught me so much about the faith. It's unbelievable. So now you're welcome. Now I'm addicted, and so I need to know more. So the purpose of my call was really to ask y'all or ask you what book or books you might recommend to someone that is a Christian, I believe, but knows absolutely nothing about the Catholic faith. And I could probably use one, too, just so I could give a better explanation when people ask me about it, because I'm constantly defending my faith.
Well, there are any number of books that would that I'd recommend, depending on what the person's needs are. I mean, to my mind, the very best book to give someone is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because it's a comprehensive look at what the church teaches. The thing is, it's in language that's a little flowery, especially at times, and it's kind of long, so it could be a little intimidating for someone. A shorter book that covers the same territory is the Compendium of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is a shorter book that is in question and answer format. When it comes to sustained narratives, a very short book that makes a basic case for the Catholic faith and what it believes is one that I wrote called The Words of Eternal Life. And we can see about, since you're here in the United States, we can see about sending you a copy of that if you'll hang on the line. Another book that I often recommend is one I wrote called A Daily Defense, which is a 365-day book. It's got a page, a different objection to either faith or the Christian faith or the Catholic faith specifically on each day for 365 days. Only since I love you, I included a 366th day for leap year. And it covers a lot of the questions and objections that people might raise to the Catholic faith. Then there are other books like Trent Horn's Why We're Catholic that is kind of an intermediate book in terms of it's a basic presentation of the faith that's somewhat longer than Words of Eternal Life, but without knowing more about the person's needs and interests, those are some of the ones I'd turn to first.
Nancy, thanks so much for that call. And like Jimmy said, if you hang on the line and speak to Edgar, he'll pick up your line again. He will get you hooked up with those two books that Jimmy mentioned that he wrote, Words of Eternal Life and A Daily Defense. Just hang on the line, don't hang up, and Edgar will be back with you momentarily. Let's move on now to Michael calling from Virginia. Michael, you are on the air. What is your question for Jimmy Akin?
Hey, good evening. Can you hear me? I'm in my headphones right now.
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. I was calling because I come from a Protestant background. I just started in OCIA, so we're on course there. But the question that I was having was related to the teachings of the rapture that are usually in the Protestant church. I understand, to my understanding, Catholic Church doesn't teach or accept that teaching. But in Matthew 24, I was looking for some understanding on that because Jesus talks about the tribulation and the end of days. But further down in verses 40 and 41, he talks about how there are two people that are working in the field, they're going about their daily business, and then one goes away without notice. Now, I haven't heard anybody explain to me what that would mean outside of a rapture explanation. I was hoping you could help.
Okay. So there are several, you raised several issues, and I understand, where you're coming from, so I want to try to address all of them. The basis for what Protestants refer to as and it's not all Protestants, but it's actually a minority of Protestants, but among those Protestants who do believe in what is referred to as the rapture, the basis for that is 1 Thessalonians 4:17, where Paul talks about how when Christ returns, we'll be caught up in the air to be with him, and we'll be with him forever. Now, when you study that passage carefully, both 1 Thessalonians 4 and more broadly in both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, it's clear that what Paul is talking about is happening at the end of the world. This is not something more than 1,000 years before the end of the world. So Catholics don't have a problem saying we're going to be caught up to be with Jesus and we're always going to be with Jesus. It's just it's going to happen at the end of the world. What Catholics don't accept is the idea that more than 1,000 years before the end of the world, this is going to happen. When we then turn to Matthew 24, which is part of what's known as the Olivet Discourse, you mentioned Jesus talking about the end of days and so forth. Actually, that's mostly not what he's talking about. Matthew 24 is part of a 2-chapter dialogue or 2-chapter monologue in Matthew. Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse is both chapters 24 and 25. This text is paralleled in Mark 13 and in Luke 21. And one of the things you find, especially if you start with Mark, which is the earliest version, and also when you look at Luke and you read them, it is clear Jesus is not talking about the end of the world. What happens in all 3 versions of the Olivet Discourse, and by the way, I gave a talk on exactly this subject at this year's Catholic Answers Conference just over a month ago in September. Unfortunately, that talk doesn't yet seem to be on YouTube, but it will be coming out on YouTube. So you can, when it does come out, you can watch that, and it'll walk through the Olivet Discourse in detail and cover everything I'm saying right now in more depth. But what happens in all 3 versions is Jesus and the disciples are coming out of the temple. One of the disciples points to the big stones and beautiful buildings and is kind of marveling at it. And Jesus says, you see all these stones? There's not going to be one left on another that's not going to be thrown down. And then they cross the Kidron Valley and go to the Mount of Olives, which is why this is called the Olivet Discourse. And they say, okay, you just said the temple's going to be destroyed. This is the pride of our nation. I mean, we need closure on this. Tell us, when is this going to happen and what's the sign that it's about to happen? And those are the only subjects that are on the table in Mark's version and in Luke's version. So the core of this discourse is not about the end of the world. It's about the destruction of the temple in AD 70. When we turn to Matthew, we find that the vast bulk of the discourse is the same as what we see in Mark and Luke. And it starts the same way. They're in the temple. They marvel at the temple. Jesus says the temple's going to be destroyed. They go to the Mount of Olives. They ask for more clarity. But in Matthew, there's a second question, which is, what's going to be the sign of your coming? And that suggests that in Matthew's version, which is longer, we're going to have some additional material about the end of the world. So most of Matthew's version, which is found in chapter 24, is devoted to the same material that's in Mark and Luke. It's about the destruction of the temple. But then we transition, particularly in chapter 25, to a set of parables. And by the end of the series of parables, it's clear we're talking about the second coming, because we close with the parable of the sheep and the goats, where at the second coming, the Son of Man sits on his throne and divides the nations like a shepherd divides the sheep from the goats, and the sheep go into eternal life and the goats go into eternal punishment. So it's clear that by the end of chapter 25 in Matthew, we are now talking about the end of the world. But most of what's in Matthew, which is in chapter 24, is the non-parabolic material that is about the destruction of the temple. So what about the specific passage that you referred to, which is where Jesus says he's talking about in those days, and so following on from all this stuff about the temple, in those days it will be like it was in the days of Noah. People were, before the flood, were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. They did not know until the flood came and swept them all away. Okay, so that's what the image of sweeping someone away is here. And he says, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And the coming in this case is the coming in judgment on Jerusalem. This is language we find in the Old Testament about God coming in judgment on places. He says 2 men will be in the field, one is taken and one is left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one is taken and one is left. So the image here is not of people being taken away to be with Jesus. The image here is being swept away like people at the flood were swept away in judgment. In this case, the judgment is not going to be an inundation or flood of water, but it's going to be the war that Jesus is warning about. Like in Luke's version, he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that its desolation is near. And so he's warning people about the coming war with the Romans that is going to happen in the AD 60s and culminate with the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And he says, when you see the warning signs of that, get out of Judea. Do not go back to get a cloak. Don't go back to get anything. Just get out now, because if you don't, then you're likely to get killed. And so that seems to be what he's referring to when he says one is going to be taken. He means taken away by judgment, and one will be left. Some will survive, but others are going to get killed when the Romans come in and start killing everybody.
Michael, how does that do for you? I know that was a lot. Did Jimmy answer your question?
Yeah, it does answer the question, although it still kind of leaves me wondering if it's talking about the Roman siege. How does that relate to then? How's that relevance carry forward into us in our modern year 2024?
Well, we don't seem to be living in an age when some world authority like the Romans are about to invade Israel. So I would say it doesn't really apply to 2024. It may have an echo in the future. That's possible. But that's a matter of speculation, because what the text is clearly talking about in its literal sense is the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. It's possible there could be a future fulfillment, but it is not certain.
Michael.
And there's a lot more to say about this. I would recommend getting that talk and watching it, on YouTube when it comes out.
Yeah, sorry, Michael. I can't say exactly when those talks will be released. It'll be sometime in the coming months. I know Zach is working hard on getting those edited and up. But just keep an eye out on our YouTube channel for those conference talks. Thanks so much for calling, Michael. Hope you call again. That opens up another line, 888-318.
I should mention it'll also be on my YouTube channel. So if you go to youtube.com/Jimmy Akin and subscribe and hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a video, then you'll actually get a notification when the video comes out.
Of course. Hey, subscribe to 2 channels while you're at it. Catholic Answers and Jimmy Akin. Subscribe to both of those. Hit the bell, get notified every time we post a video, and one of those times it will be Jimmy's talk at our previous conference. Again, 888-318-7884 is the number to call if you want to get on the air and talk to Jimmy Akin, ask him any question you like. And before we head to another break, I got to tell you about this weekend on shop.catholic.com. We've got the ultimate BOGO category sale. BOGO, of course, marketing speak for buy one, get one. Here's how it works. You go to shop.catholic.com, and if you're on desktop, you'll go to the left side and you'll see the ultimate BOGO category. If you're on your phone, you click the little 3-line menu at the top left and open it up, and you'll see it's the ultimate BOGO there right at the top. You hit that, and you will see the beginning of over 450 resources from which to choose. Books, ebooks, MP3s, digital videos, all of our online School of Apologetics courses. You can browse and browse and browse. Shop around. You find any 2 items that you like, place them in your cart, and you will automatically get the lower priced item for free. No promo code needed. You don't have to put anything in. You buy 4 items, you get 2 of them for free, on and on. For every 2 you choose, you get 1 for free, always the lower priced one. So like I said, go to shop.catholic.com, hit the ultimate BOGO category on the left, and shop to your delight. But this only lasts today through Sunday. This is a weekend deal only. So shop.catholic.com, the ultimate BOGO. We'll be right back with more Catholic Answers Live right after this.
This is Archbishop Paul Coakley, the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, and you're listening to Catholic Answers Live.
Who was the first Catholic in your family? Were they evangelized by a friend, a coworker, a stranger? Did you ever think that you could be that person that God uses to save a soul, and that soul could save their family, their grandchildren, and generations to come? At St. Paul Street Evangelization, a Catholic nonprofit, we train, equip, and mobilize Catholic disciples to do the urgent work of evangelization. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization, streetevangelization.com.
Another weekend means another chance for us to build our community of faith on this weekend's Catholics Coast to Coast. I'm Ace McKay and invite you to join me as we highlight the conversations happening. Go to Podcast Central at EWTN.com/radio. That way you can take them with you, share them, like, subscribe, follow, whatever you need to do so you don't miss future episodes. So join me for Catholics Coast to Coast tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Thomas Graff sitting in here for Cy Kellett, taking you home on a Friday as we do Ask Me Anything, one of our favorite shows to do with senior apologist Jimmy Akin. The number to call is 888-318-7884 if you want to call in with your question. And we are going to keep things moving right along as we go to Vincent calling from Colombia and watching us on YouTube. Vincent, you're on the air. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy Akin.
Buenas tardes,
Hello,
Vincent.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Okay. Well, my question is, I would like to know Jimmy Akin's opinion about Old Testament laws. I don't really understand how God can command capital punishment in things like we don't see the necessity to apply capital punishment now. For example, in Leviticus chapter 21, verse 9, the daughter of the high priest can be, the Israelites can apply the capital punishment on her. So I would like to know how can we reconcile this kind of harsh laws with the fact that we cannot do that now. I would like to know your opinion about that.
Okay, so there are two ways of approaching this. The first way is to assuming that we shouldn't use capital punishment under any circumstances today. One of the reasons for that would be that we live in a different situation than people in the ancient world did. Today, we have even developing nations are much, much more economically developed than they were in the time of the Old Testament. And so consequently, we can afford to have things like prisons where we put someone in prison and have guards and can maintain them and stuff like that. We have the extra resources that we've now developed economically to permit that. But this was not the case, in 1000 BC. When King David reigned, people were, even rich people were typically living by standards that we would consider, in poverty. And they did not have a developed economy that would support a prison system. So what are you going to do with people? Well, they had a number of options. One option was you give them corporal punishment. You beat them with sticks or something, and that might, and then you're done. You let them go. After you've beaten them, you let them go, and that way they're not a perpetual burden on the state, which is composed of people who are just trying to survive. And so, giving someone a beating or a scourging would suffice for a minor crime. You'll notice, like when Pilate wants to let Jesus go, he's willing to just kind of scourge him or beat him and then let him go, but his opponents demand more than that. Well, another thing that could happen if someone had debts they couldn't pay is they could be sold into slavery, and then the slave owner would maintain the person. But what do you do with someone who's genuinely dangerous? Well, okay, they didn't have prisons to keep people in for years and years and years and decades. So you needed and it wasn't safe to just sell them into slavery because, they would, if they're, say, a murderer, well, how do you know they're not just going to murder whoever you sell them to? So the only real way to deal with someone in a dangerous situation like that is if you execute them so they can't be a danger to anybody in the future. So that would be an explanation. But then as the economy develops, the situations in which you need to do that become fewer and fewer because society is able to afford an established prison system. So that's one way of looking at this. But what about passages in the Old Testament that don't apply just to people who are dangerous, like murderers, that apply to other situations, like the one you mentioned? Well, here's where a second principle comes into play. The second principle is God shaped the law that he permitted for the Israelites to their culture. So it depended on what they were willing to accept. And, this is something that we know God did because Jesus refers to it. If you look, for example, in Matthew chapter 19, he's having the question, and in Mark chapter 10, he's having the question put to him, is under what circumstances is divorce okay? Meaning divorce and remarriage. And he says, basically, it's not okay to divorce and remarry someone. If you're validly married to someone, you shouldn't be divorcing and either you or the divorced spouse getting remarried. And then he gets asked, well, then why did Moses let us divorce our wives? And he says, Moses did that because your hearts were hard. In other words, you were not willing to accept God's true standard. So God accommodated his law to what you were willing to accept. And if that principle applies there, it can apply to other issues like the death penalty. The ancient Israelites were not willing to, especially at the time of the giving of the law, which was, like I mentioned, like 1,000 years or more before the time of Christ. They were not willing to accept God's true standard for holiness. They were at the beginning of their walk with God, and they were still heavily affected by their pagan culture. In fact, a persistent problem was they were even worshiping pagan gods. So they were heavily influenced by paganism. They were not willing to accept various things that God wanted. And so God accommodated his law to who he was working with. And then gradually over the course of time, he led the Israelites into a greater understanding of his will. And through the Holy Spirit, he's continued to lead the church into a greater understanding of his will. And so there's more I could say about all that, but we're getting kind of close to the end of the episode. So I'll kind of leave it there, but those are some of the principles that would be involved in navigating this subject.
Vincent, thanks so much for your call. Please do call again. As Jimmy said, we are getting close to the end of the hour. I think we can squeeze in one last question from Stephen in New York, listening on YouTube. Stephen, you're going to have to be real quick with your question, but go ahead.
Hi. I just have a question about the praying or the intercession of prayer to saints. And there's a lot that I have to talk about it, but I know that I'm limited on time. So I guess my main objection to it is that I feel as if only God can judge the heart, and I have, multiple things that say that. So every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart. Proverbs 21:2.
Yeah. Stephen, I'm going to need to respond because we're about to run out of time. If your main objection to praying to the saints or asking the saints for their intercession, to say it more formally, is that only God can judge the heart, well, I would agree. God is the only one who has intimate knowledge of our hearts, and so the saints don't, as far as we know, have intimate knowledge of our hearts. Consequently, it is not, at least as far as the church is concerned, it is not by knowing our hearts that the saints are aware of our prayers. Now, how are they aware of our prayers? That we're not sure of, but we do have passages in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Revelation, indicating that one way or another they do know about our prayers and present them to God. The common opinion theologically about how they know our prayers is God tells them. God does know our hearts, and so even if I'm praying silently and ask my late wife to pray to God for me. God knows that, and then he can tell my late wife, hey, Jimmy wants your prayers right now.
Stephen, thanks so much for calling. I'm sorry we couldn't get your full question in, but please do.
You can call back in the future. Just make sure you got it in the form of a question. We won't have time for lengthy passages of Scripture.
Yeah, please do call again, Stephen. We do want to get all aspects of your question answered. But thank you for calling anyway. That wraps it up for 1 hour of Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. But don't go anywhere. We're going to be right back here with more Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin right after this. Hello and welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. It's a show so nice we got to do it twice. We just wrapped up 1 hour of Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin, and we thought, let's do the same thing all over again. Let's have Jimmy Akin back for another hour of Ask Me Anything. I am not Cy Kellett. I am Thomas Graff, the social media manager here at Catholic Answers. Pray for Cy Kellett. Nothing's wrong. He's just traveling. You know how traveling is. He's coming back from North Dakota. God willing, he ends up back here on Monday, and he's not caught in some crazy planes, trains, and automobiles like caper that leaves him stranded somewhere out, who knows, in the Rockies or something. Anything besides that, because we want him back here in this chair and hosting this show that today is, as I said, Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. Jimmy Akin, of course, you know him as our senior apologist here at Catholic Answers, author of books such as A Daily Defense, The Words of Eternal Life, Teaching with Authority, The Bible is a Catholic Book, and owner and proprietor of multiple podcasts, most notably Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and the new the Jimmy Akin podcast, Mysteries of the Faith. Jimmy Akin, welcome back to hour 2 of our show with you today. Are you ready to dive into more questions?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, let's dive right in to the question from Ann, calling from Colorado. Ann, you're on the air. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy Akin.
You're doing a terrific job.
Oh, thank you so much, Ann. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Anyway, this harkens back to a question you answered already, but I would like you to clarify it a little bit on Adam and Eve, whether they exist. You said they can be symbolic. Does that mean that they're not real historical figures?
Well, I mentioned 3 options. One was Adam and Eve were 2 real individuals that were the only ones at the beginning of the human race. The second was that they were 2 real individuals that were part of a broader population. And the third was that they were symbols of the broader population. And the church these days permits all 3 of those.
But I don't understand what you mean by symbol.
Well, it would mean that there was not a literal single dude named Adam and a literal single gal named Eve, but that the figure of Adam in Genesis represents and Eve represent the early human community composed of multiple men and women. And together collectively together collectively they committed original sin. They turned away from God, and we've inherited original sin ever since then.
How would that affect original sin? I mean, if it wasn't individual people, and the Catechism actually states that they were individual people.
No, the Catechism doesn't say that. The Catechism uses the language of Genesis, but it does not mandate a particular interpretation of that language. And it's actually framed rather carefully. At various points, it'll talk about our first parents without discussing the number of the first parents. This is something that has been discussed, for example, by Joseph Ratzinger and Cardinal Gerhard Muller and others. And as I mentioned, the International Theological Commission published a document where it was open to the possibility that they were symbols of the early human community as a population, and it didn't have a problem with that. And Cardinal Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI, approved the publication of that document, which he was only allowed to do on the condition that the magisterium didn't have a problem with it. So what you find is there is a mix of views on this subject, and because the church hasn't settled this question, it tends, especially in basic documents like a catechism, it tends to use traditional language, but then it in other documents will explore additional possibilities. And in fact, in some national catechisms, more than one, it approved the publication of the Vatican approved the publication of national catechisms that were more exploratory on this, and that said, yeah, you could interpret them in these other ways and it would still be legitimate, and it wouldn't affect original sin as long as you understand either Adam and Eve as 2 individuals in a broader population that resulted in the fall of the entire population, or they are symbols of the entire population that turned away from God. Either way, the principle of original sin is maintained. It's just a question of how, by whom was it done? Was it done by the only two individuals that existed? Was it done by two individuals that represented a broader population, or was it done by the population as a whole?
And thanks so much for your call. I think we could plumb the depths of this subject matter all day long. It's a fascinating conversation, but we do have...
I wrote a whole unpublished book on it, so
okay.
Yes, I could go on for hours about this.
Yeah, we do, but we do have more callers on the line. So, Ann, please do call back sometime later, and we would love to pick up this conversation again. Meanwhile, let's go to Norman in Salem, Missouri, watching on YouTube. Norman, what is your question for Jimmy Akin?
Hi. I just wanted to know what the food restrictions are traditionally for Fridays. If it's only like a meat, flesh restriction, or is it all animal product restriction? I know the Byzantine Church does all animal products, but I'm not sure how lax the Latin rite is. Thank you.
Okay, so you said traditionally, and I'll answer that, but first I want to point out that in the United States, the bishops have terminated the requirement of Friday abstinence for most Fridays of the year. They recommend going meatless on all Fridays, but that's just a recommendation. It's not a requirement. Where it is required is the Fridays of Lent and also Ash Wednesday. In terms of what it consists of, in the law, it uses the Latin word carnis, and that word is which means flesh. That word is understood to apply to the flesh of land animals and the flesh of birds. It does not apply to fish. So you're welcome to eat fish on Friday in the Latin Church if you want. There are even some exceptions in places for aquatic mammals like muskrats and capybaras in South America, but those are local exceptions. The broad rule is no flesh of land animals or birds. And so since it only includes their flesh, it doesn't include things like eggs or milk. So you can have eggs and milk and cheese and stuff like that. And you can even have according to a careful reading of the law, you can even have soups made with meat and other sauces made with meat. So you don't need to worry if it has animal fat or little bits of animal flesh in it, if it's a soup or a meat or a soup or a sauce. That's something I covered on my personal website, jimmyakin.com. If you go there and you look under popular posts, and in the Get Started section, and then you look under Annual Lent Fight, I've got a whole series of posts dealing with exactly what is and is not required by the law in this area.
Annual Lent Fight. That's on jimmyakin.com, is that right?
Yep.
That sounds tremendous. I love that title. Do you mention that, I'm sure you do, but like that the New Orleans Archdiocese once had to clarify that, yes, alligator was permitted to eat in Lent?
I don't recall mentioning that, but I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that came up as a question down there in New Orleans. All right, Norman, thank you.
I've had alligator down there.
How'd you like it?
It was okay. It tasted kind of like, it had kind of the texture of chicken, but the taste of fish. It's kind of like frog. I don't know if you've ever had frog legs, but it's kind of like frog.
I've not had frog legs nor gator. I'm doing my New Orleans ancestors really shameful. I'm sorry to say they're very disappointed in me.
I used to go frog gigging as a boy. The men in my family would go out and hunt frogs, and then we'd gig them, which is like using a little trident-like tool to spear them, and then you bring them back and you prepare them and fry them up, and we'd have frog legs.
That is so cool. In an alternate universe, Jimmy Akin is a traveling frog leg salesman, like the bad guy in the Muppet movie. Right. Norman, thanks so much for that question. I hope that was helpful to you. Let's go now to Aaron in Hastings, Michigan, watching on YouTube. Aaron, go ahead with your question for Jimmy Akin.
Hi, guys. Thanks for taking my call. My question is, why did God allow or tell Hosea, the prophet, to have relations with prostitutes?
He didn't. He told Hosea to marry a woman who had been a prostitute. And then but that's different than saying, go down to the red light district and sleep with a bunch of prostitutes. He did not tell him to engage in prostitution himself. He told him to marry a woman who was a prostitute, but that's not the same thing. And the reason he did that was to serve as an object lesson. Israel had been unfaithful to God by whoring after other deities, which is portrayed symbolically as Israel is acting like a prostitute. Instead of being faithful to the Lord her God, she's sleeping with other gods, worshiping other gods, which is like sleeping with another man. And so she's been unfaithful. And to illustrate the unfaithfulness of Israel, Hosea was told to marry a woman who was a prostitute. So in this relationship, Hosea who was faithful to this woman, represented God, and the wife, Mrs. Hosea, who was unfaithful, represented Israel. And then so that was the first aspect of the object lesson. But eventually the prostitute wife repents, and that becomes an object, and Hosea is told to take her back. And that is a symbol of God's willingness to take Israel back despite her infidelities. So when Israel repents and comes back to God, he will take her back the same way Hosea took back his unfaithful wife.
Norm, thanks so much for that question. I hope that was helpful. It's Ask Me Anything today with Jimmy Akin. The number to call if you have a question for Jimmy is 888-318-7884. 888-31-TRUTH is the number to call. I want to tell you again about our 2025 Sacred Art Calendar that we have available. You just go right to Catholic.com, hit the banner at the top, the big bright orange banner at the top to get your calendar. And again, we're featuring today, just want to tell you again about the January artist named Martin Earl from Great Britain, who carved this polychromed altar frontal called Adoration. You can see it if you're watching. Excuse me. It's the Adoration of the Magi. He carved this from oak for a parish in Austin, Texas, and as well as carving in wood and stone. Martin paints an egg tempera, excuse me again, gilt, makes mosaics, and creates designs for other makers to execute. Get yours at Catholic.com. The banner at the top. We'll be right back.
Miss a show? Make sure to catch up by downloading the podcast, available online at Catholic.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects homebuyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Magnificat. Published monthly, Magnificat features texts of daily Mass, prayers, articles, meditations, art commentaries, and more, in step with the liturgical rhythm of the Church, on the web at magnificat.com.
We should pray because prayer is conversation with God, and conversation is the only way to build a relationship. We need that relationship with God. We should pray and talk with God about what's on our hearts, what's on our minds, what's active in our lives, the joys we have. We should share all of these with God. Prayer is conversation, and conversation is the only way to build a relationship with God. It's the most important relationship. All of our other relationships depend on this one.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Thomas Graff here, sitting in for Cy Kellett, recovered from the coughing fit that you may have heard right at the end of that last segment. And we're all healthy and ready to go here on Catholic Answers Live with Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. Number to call is 888-318-7884 if you want to get on the line to talk to Jimmy. And we're going now to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where Andrew is watching on YouTube. Andrew, go ahead with your question for Jimmy Akin.
Hi, Jimmy. Just wondering, can we truly know if we are saved? And if we don't really know, then why in 1 John 5:13 does it say, I've written unto you that you may know you have eternal life?
Well, so First John is a great illustration of how we can know that we're saved. He provides ways of knowing that, and the principal one is: do we love people? Do we love God? Do we love our fellow Christians? And more broadly, do we love other human beings? He says that God is love, and no one who doesn't love knows God. So if you are a Christian and you're a genuinely loving person, then yeah, you can know you're saved. Now, this is within the limits of human knowledge. So this is, he's not denying the possibility of self-deception. As Jeremiah says, the heart is desperately wicked, who can know it? So there is the possibility of error here, but broadly speaking, we can say we know stuff, like I know my pickup is out in my garage right now. That doesn't mean I'm infallible on that point. It's possible that some thieves have just broken in and stolen it while I've been here on the radio, but that's such a remote possibility. I don't need to worry about it given the evidence I have, and I can just use human language and say, in a human way, I know that my pickup is in my garage, without claiming to be infallible on that point. And the same thing is, that's all the Catholic Church claims, is that, we can't in this life have infallible knowledge of salvation unless, God specially reveals it to you, but you can have knowledge, broadly speaking, in a human sense of the fact you're saved. And that's actually agreed to in the Protestant community. This is, sometimes you'll hear Protestants saying, oh, Catholics have this terrible uncertainty of salvation, and you can't know if you're saved if you're a Catholic. And that's just not true. If you cross-examine that viewpoint and say to a Protestant who has this view, well, are you, in claiming that you're saved, are you claiming human knowledge, or are you claiming divine infallibility of knowledge? Or could you possibly be self-deceived? Is that even a hypothetical possibility? And the overwhelming majority of Protestant theologians at that point will say, well, I'm not claiming infallible knowledge. I'm just saying I have human knowledge. And so this is really not a point of disagreement. There may be individuals in the Protestant community who do claim to be infallible on this and think there is no possibility of self-deception. I would want to know what their basis is for making that claim, because ordinarily when we claim knowledge of something, we're speaking in a human manner and we are not claiming infallibility for it. Most people don't claim to be infallible about anything. Catholics only claim the Pope is infallible in special circumstances. So if most of us are not infallible the vast majority of the time, that doesn't stop us from making knowledge claims, whether it's about salvation or where your pickup is or anything else.
Thanks so much for that question, Andrew. Jimmy, I think you wrote a book that could be helpful to Andrew in this regard, right? The Drama of Salvation, right? You think that would be helpful?
Cover? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think we can send a free copy of that along to you, Andrew, if you just hang on the line. We will, Edgar will get your information and send a copy of Jimmy's book, The Drama of Salvation, to you. We'll keep it moving. We'll go to Springfield, Missouri now, where Stuart is listening on YouTube. Stuart, welcome to Catholic Answers Live. What is your question for Jimmy?
Yeah, I work in a jewelry store, and the other day a gentleman had a ring, and like a fraternity ring, and on it were the letters SMOTJ. And so I looked it up and Googled it, and it was the Sovereign Military Order Temple of Jerusalem. And so I was talking to the guy about it here and there, and he was already like, oh, I can be your sponsor and this and that. And I didn't know if it was something okay for Catholics. I know we got the Knights of Columbus, but I was just curious what it was. And yeah.
Okay, so the Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem is what's known as a Neo-Templarist organization. Neo-Templarism is a movement. It's a group of organizations that claim to be inspired by or descendants of the Templar order, which was broadly disbanded several centuries ago. There are I know there's at least one actual branch of the Templars that still exists today in Europe. But broadly speaking, the Templar order was disbanded. And so most of the groups claiming connection with the Templars are not actually connected with the Templars. For example, some Masonic organizations make this claim. In the case of the Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem, they were actually founded in 1804 by a guy named Bernard. I won't say this the French way because I'd have to think about it and probably would get it wrong even then, but a guy named Bernard Raymond Fabre Palaprat, however you would pronounce that in French. And so they're not an actual survival of the Knights Templar. And these days they don't even claim to be. They did claim that for a time, but they've since taken back that claim. So I also their founder, he later founded something called the Johannite Church, which is a Gnostic Christian denomination. So it is not Catholic, and in general, I would say I really wouldn't have. I'd have to do more research to say conclusively, but based on what I know about this group, I would say it's one that Catholics should not be involved in.
Stuart, thanks so much for that question. Hope that helped you out.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great. All right. Thanks for that. And that'll open up another line. So the number to call is 888-318-7884 to be brought on the air of this edition of Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. Jimmy, we're going to go now to Minnesota. Richard is listening on Ave Maria Radio. Richard, go ahead with your question for Jimmy Akin.
Yeah. Hi, and thank you for accepting my call. I've been interacting with some Protestants who deny that the Deuterocanonical books should be part of the canon. They say that the Jewish canon excluded them. I disagree, obviously, based on what the church says. But obviously, if you don't believe what the church says, what can you point to? How can I guess, explain or...
Okay.
I may not be able to.
So we're coming up on the hard break. So let me take a stab at this. Even if there was a Jewish canon of the Old Testament, so what? We're not Jews, and we're to look to the church. And the apostles quoted from the Septuagint when they quoted scripture 80 to 90% of the time in the New Testament, and the Septuagint included these books. So we are, as Christians, don't consider what, quote unquote, the Jews thought as definitive for us. If we did, we wouldn't be Christians. We wouldn't believe in Jesus. Second point, there was no Jewish canon. There were a group of Jewish canonical traditions, and the one that modern Jews use was only used by some Jews in the time of Jesus. Other Jews had different canons, some of them smaller, some of them larger. And some of the larger ones, like the ones the Christian Jews used, included the Deuterocanonicals. There's more to say about all that, and I actually say it in my book, The Bible is a Catholic Book. And since we're about to hit the break, Richard, why don't you stay on the line? We'll get your address, and we'll send you a copy of The Bible is a Catholic Book, and you can read all about it.
Richard, just like Jimmy said, hang on the line there, and Edgar will get your information and send you back a free copy of Jimmy's book, The Bible is a Catholic Book. It's open, not open forum anymore. It's Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. The number to call is 888-318-7884. And after Richard is off the line with Edgar, there will be 3 lines open. So now's the time to call if you want to get your question answered by Jimmy Akin. Again, the number 888-318-7884, 888-31-TRUTH. Jimmy Akin is our guest, our senior apologist, author, speaker, podcaster. Once again, his podcast drops today, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. I believe you said it was the first of a 3-parter about Medjugorje, right?
Yep, that's right. Today we look at the background of the apparitions. Next week we look at the church's decision, and the week after that I do my own analysis and tell you what I think.
That's right. And then the episode of the Jimmy Akin podcast, The Mysteries of the Faith, the one that will drop on Monday, will be about the commonly asked question about whether when we die, whether we exit time. That's the question you ponder, right?
That's the question, and the answer is a big no, and I've got church teaching to back it up.
A big no, and Jimmy Akin is swinging that church teaching around to prove it. That is the Jimmy Akin podcast, available on most podcast platforms, I believe all of them. And it's the same thing with the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World podcast, also available wherever you find podcasts. We'll be back. We'll be right back for another final half hour of Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. Like I said, the number is 888-318-7884. The number to call, 888-318-7884. We'll be right back after this.
What was the church like in its infancy? In a word, Catholic. And Joe Heschmeyer has the receipts. In his best-selling book, The Early Church Was the Catholic Church, he gives you the details from the historical records of the first 2 centuries of Christianity. Right now, get a copy for just $10, plus free shipping if you live in the continental United States. Get more information and order The Early Church Was the Catholic Church at theearlychurchwascatholic.com.
Why We're Catholic is the one book you can hand to anyone to invite them into or back to the Catholic faith. With more than 400,000 copies sold, Trent Horn's book has had a #1 ranking on Amazon.com for 5 years running. Now available in softcover, bulk cases, ebook, and on Audible. Find out what the excitement is all about. Order your copies of Why We're Catholic at shop.catholic.com or visit whywearecatholic.com.
We hope that one of the things that we communicate here at Catholic Answers Live is that our Catholic faith allows us to be fully serious about all the problems we encounter in the church and in the world, but it also lets us have light hearts and maybe even mix in a bit of fun, and that is exactly what our good friend Joe Heschmeyer does in his popular podcast, Shameless Popery. You should check it out at shamelessjoe.com. Joe's got a deep grasp of the faith, morals, the teachings of the church, all that, but he's also got a witty conversational style. He entertains and he informs, but you will leave equipped to better answer the most common challenges, misconceptions, and questions about the Catholic faith. He's got insightful guests, he does on-air debates, and he takes a close look into all the things that you want to know about as a Catholic living today. You'll walk away knowledgeable and filled with joy. Look for Joe on his YouTube channel. Check him out at shamelessjoe.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, become a patron.
Catholic Answers Live. We're grooving to groovy music. We're answering questions. We're giving away free books. We're taking your calls on Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. The number to call is 888-318-7884. As we take you into the weekend with this last half hour of Catholic Answers Live, I am Thomas Graff, the social media manager here at Catholic Answers, and filling in for Cy Kellett, who will, God willing, be back with us on Monday to reclaim his rightful place in this seat. Meanwhile, you're stuck with me, so we are going to we're going to move on down to Monique, who is calling from Idaho on Salt and Light, listening on Salt and Light Radio. Monique, you are on with Jimmy Akin. What is your question? Oh, hello, and Monique's dog.
I'm sorry, we have bad dogs. I'm sorry.
That's okay. If they have questions, they can ask too.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about if you have abilities and talents that God gave you, then how do you know how to use them to the best of your ability?
Well, basically, you experiment. You can also pray, for guidance in how to use these abilities. You can pray for opportunities to use these abilities. You can ally with, other people who are engaged in the same work to amplify your abilities. You can take training to improve your abilities. But fundamentally, you want to experiment. Just try and by the process of, attempting to use your abilities, you'll get better at doing so under God's guidance and by reason of, the principle of practice makes perfect, or at least practice makes permanent. And so, practice and look for opportunities, and look for opportunities to work with other people using these talents. And that's how you do it.
Thank you so much for that call, Monique and friends. I do hope you call again soon. Let's go now. Excuse me. Let's go now to our very own home turf, calling from San Diego here. We have John watching on Twitch. And John, welcome to Catholic Answers. What's your question for Jimmy Akin?
Oh, thank you, Thomas and Jimmy, for taking my call. I have a question about the science fiction book Day of the Triffids. I hope you've heard of it, Jimmy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Killer plants, yeah.
Man-eating plants is one element of it, but it also has an element of apocalyptic situation. So people get in an apocalyptic situation where they're in small bands of people that are trying to rebuild civilization, essentially.
Yeah, the Triffids really do a number on the human race.
They do, yeah. It's amazing. So the situation in one of the groups was that some of the leaders were saying polygamy was the answer to repopulate the earth. And a splinter group of the Christians in there said, no way, we're not doing that. Is there any situation where that could be morally permissible?
Well, the church has not addressed this issue. The church teaches that marriage is meant to be monogamous, but it hadn't. That's the church's current teaching. There have been some instances in the past where members of the magisterium were open to polygamy, but for several centuries, as a kind of exceptional thing. But for several centuries, there's been a teaching that that marriage is meant to be monogamous. Now, if we ever got into an apocalyptic situation and had to face this question, and by the way, I should probably mention why. The idea, so there's a difference between polygamy, which is having multiple wives, and polyandry, which is having multiple husbands. Now, if the human race has been, shrunk down to almost nobody from its present size, and there's just a few people left, and you need to rebuild humanity, polyandry, having multiple husbands, is not going to help you. What really would help you would be polygamy, because men are, because of how we're biologically configured, one man can impregnate multiple women, and thus you could get the human race going quicker if you had more women than men. Then having polygamy would be a way of rebuilding the human race faster. But women can only have one pregnancy at a time. I mean, apart from twins and triplets and stuff. But there's no way to control that. So polyandry won't really help you rebuild the population, but polygamy would, assuming that you have more women than men. Because if you've got equal numbers of men and women, whatever the number is, polygamy is not going to help you. If you've got 10 men and 10 women, well, marry off each of the 10 men to one of the 10 women, and as they say in The Incredibles, get busy. But because you've only got 10 women, you're only going to have 10 babies, barring weird circumstances. So if you had one guy, if you have 10 men, but you only let one of them marry the 10 women, you're still only going to have 10 pregnancies. So polygamy would only work if you had an imbalance of the sexes with more women than men. So if we ever got into an apocalyptic situation, the church could relook at this subject and consider whether or not polygamy would be morally permissible in this circumstance. And it might, because it hadn't infallibly defined this. So it could hypothetically look back to precedents where, let's say, the Pope was willing to entertain the possibility that didn't end up happening of the Landgrave of Hesse, marrying more than one woman or something. And it hypothetically might say, okay, in an apocalyptic situation that's legitimate, but that's purely speculative because we're not in that situation now. And the church's present teaching, even though it's not infallible, is that marriage is to be monogamous. And that's something you can also infer from Jesus's statement, where he in Matthew 19, he holds up the situation of Adam and Eve to us as God's original design for mankind. God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Eve and Barbara. And so, God did tolerate polygamy in the Old Testament, but we also know that he tolerated other things that were in conflict with his fundamental will. And so the question of, is polygamy something that can be justified in some circumstances, or is it fundamentally contrary to God's will such that it's intrinsically immoral? That would have to be something that's sorted out, but the church's present understanding is we shouldn't be doing that. Having said that, the church hasn't specifically addressed a population bottleneck caused by apocalyptic circumstances, such as a Triffid invasion.
John, thanks so much for that question. Really fascinating answer there by Jimmy. Thanks so much for that. 888-318-7884 is the number to call on this Ask Me Anything, and we do mean anything. No question too weird for this hour with Jimmy Akin, not even a question about an apocalypse caused by flesh-eating plants. I believe that was the scenario.
Yep. Yeah, that's what Triffids are.
That's what Triffids are, or would be. Hopefully they remain
mobile flesh-eating plants.
Hopefully they remain just science fiction. I don't look forward to that kind of apocalypse. What I do look forward to is this call from Nathan, who's calling from Temple, Texas, listening on 93.9 FM. Nathan, you're on the air with Jimmy Akin. What is your question?
Hello, sir. Thank you for taking my question. Yes, sir. I've noticed in the Bible how Peter commanded or told the people to be baptized in the name of Jesus. And when he used the word baptize, he used the word baptizo, which means to fully immerse. My question is, why does the Catholic faith not do that?
Not baptize by full immersion and in the name of Jesus? You're asking about both of those?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. So in regard to immersion, well, the Catholic Church does. Immersion is one of the permitted modes of baptism. The other is what's known as effusion or pouring. One that is not permitted in the Catholic Church is aspersion or sprinkling. We do not sprinkle people. But both immersion and effusion, so dunking or pouring, both of those are permitted. And that's permitted by the verb baptizo in Greek. It does not simply mean immerse. It has other meanings too. It's like a lot of words. It has a range of different meanings, or what linguists refer to as a semantic range. And we have evidence dating from the 1st century that Christians understood baptizo as including more than just immersion. There is a document known as the Didache, which is a 1st century Christian document that envisions there being multiple modes of baptism. It says if you can, you want to baptize in cold running water. If you don't have cold running water, then baptize in running water. If you don't have running water, then baptize in standing water. And if you don't have that, if you don't have standing water, then pour water on the head 3 times. Now, you could debate about those first options I mentioned, because you could have someone standing in cold water or running water, and then you pour water on their head. And if you look in classic examples of Christian art, you'll see John the Baptist doing exactly that to Jesus. Jesus is standing in the River Jordan, and John the Baptist is pouring water over his head. But it's certain that we have different forms of baptism here, and that pouring water over the head was one of them that was permitted in the 1st century. So the Catholic Church correspondingly permits either immersion or effusion today. Now, what about the name of Jesus? Well, the reason the Catholic Church doesn't use that is because Jesus himself in Matthew 28 tells us to baptize in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. But that name is not Jesus. The Father is not named Jesus. The Holy Spirit is not named Jesus. Jesus is the name of the Son. And so the Catholic Church follows what Matthew says, which is baptize in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Now, there's a question of, well, if you did just baptize using just the name of Jesus, would it be valid? And that's actually an open question that the church has not definitively settled in terms of doctrine. But as a matter of practice, the church follows the practice that's indicated in the Gospel of Matthew in the Great Commission.
Thanks so much for that question, Nathan. We're going to keep on moving because we got full lines here today. But we are going to take a quick break first before we do that. And before we get to that break, I also want to tell you that this weekend we have our ultimate BOGO sale going on. BOGO means buy one, get one. Here's how it works. You visit shop.catholic.com and head to the ultimate BOGO category. If you're on desktop, that's going to be on the left side of the screen. If you're on mobile, you're just going to hit those 3 lines to open up the menu, and it'll be the first option, the ultimate BOGO category, where you will have over 450 resources from which to choose: books, ebooks, MP3s, digital videos, all of our online School of Apologetics courses. You shop around, you find any 2 items and place them in your cart. You will get the lower priced item for free, no promo code needed. Just keep on going. Every 2 items you choose, you get 1 for free. Go to shop.catholic.com and head to the ultimate BOGO category this weekend, but it will only last today through Sunday. This is a weekend exclusive sale. So again, shop.catholic.com, the ultimate BOGO category to take advantage. We'll be right back with our final segment of Catholic Answers Live right after this.
There's only one Catholic Answers Live.
The Catechism defines evangelization as the proclamation of Christ and his gospel by word and the testimony of life. But what does that look like in real life? It looks like St. Paul street evangelists out in the public square sharing the good news. We're a Catholic nonprofit that starts conversations by handing out free sacramentals. Then we employ our method of listen, befriend, proclaim, and invite. Catholic Answers is supported in part by St. Paul Street Evangelization. Visit streetevangelization.com to learn more.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
I told him about the woman who came to me and said her 2 children hadn't spoken to each other for 2 years. Their grandma died, and she was very wealthy. She left half to each one. She said they're arguing over a commode. She said it's inlaid. Can you imagine being in hell and somebody saying to you, "What are you here for?"
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Catholic Answers Live, taking you home on this Friday with Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. The number to call is 888-318-7884. The lines are full right now, though, so we're going to try and get through as many of these as we can before the show ends. So we're going to go to Nicholas, listening in Canada, watching us on Twitch. Nicholas, you're on the air with Jimmy Akin. Go right ahead with your question.
Hi, Jimmy. Thanks for taking another one of my questions. The Dead Sea Scrolls contained all of the Hebrew Bible except Esther. I was hoping you could tell us a bit of trivia about those texts from Qumran, and if you have any speculations on why that book would be absent.
Well, so there were a lot. I'm not sure. I know a lot of trivia about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm not sure what you might have in mind. But in terms of Esther, it's true. Esther is the only book of the Hebrew scriptures that was not found at Qumran. And there is speculation as to why that might be. One possibility is it was originally part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that scroll just didn't survive. You know, they didn't all survive. The Dead Sea Scrolls suffered damage over the last 2,000 years before they were discovered, and that it's possible that scroll was one that just got so degraded that we no longer have it. It's also possible it was there and somebody checked it out of their library and didn't return it before they got destroyed. It's also possible that they just didn't happen to have a copy. It's not that they were opposed to it. It's just they didn't have a copy of it. And then there is a more intriguing speculation, which is they deliberately excluded it, that they didn't want it because they didn't consider it to be scripture. And an argument in favor of that last proposal is that they had very, 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 very strict views about how the calendar was supposed to work that disagreed with the views of other Jewish people. In fact, this was one of their criticisms of the temple in Jerusalem. They thought the temple was impure, partly because the temple authorities would adjust the dates of certain feasts, and they did not use a 364-day calendar, which apparently Esther, apparently the book of Esther is in line with the views on the calendar of traditional Jews, of the temple authorities. And if that's the case, and given that the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls rejected the authorities' views of the calendar, that would also give them reason to reject the book of Esther. So that's my understanding of the main proposal for why they might have rejected the book.
Nicholas, thanks so much for that question. As I said, the lines are full, so we're going to keep right on going to try and get as many questions answered as we can. Brian in Massachusetts, listening on 1060 AM. Brian, you are on Catholic Answers Live. What's your question?
Thanks for taking my call. Couple of quick questions. My first one would be, at the Last Supper, Jesus had unleavened bread, like pita bread. And when did it come into fashion to have the host? I have yet to find that answer. I've asked priests, too, and I can't get an answer out of them. And the second question would be, when Jesus was in heaven, like God the Father is pure spirit, was Jesus pure spirit before he came down and took the form of man? And that's my question.
Okay, in regard to your first question, when did the modern form of the host develop? Because the host is a form of unleavened bread. And it's actually conjecture what shape it would have been. I mean, we can kind of guess maybe it was kind of pita-like because that was a common form of bread at the time, but we don't really know what the shape was when Jesus celebrated the Last Supper because we're not told. We know it was unleavened bread, but beyond that, we don't know what shape it was. When it comes to when did the modern common shape of the host develop, that's something I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to do research. I'm sure that the answer can be determined. I just have to do research to find it out. When it comes to your second question of was Jesus pure spirit apart from the incarnation, the answer is yes. Jesus is God. God is pure spirit. And so apart from becoming incarnate in human form, Jesus is pure spirit and does not have a body or anything like that. Now, there's a bit of a complication here because God is outside of time in the true sense. And so for him, there's not a before or after. So speaking of Jesus before he became incarnate has to be understood analogously, because before and after are earthly reference terms. They apply here on earth, but they don't apply to God in his outside of time eternal now. And so in the eternal now, the Son, or Jesus, always is becoming incarnate about the year 3 or 2 BC and remains in human form forever thereafter in time. So there is no time where God is, where Jesus was not incarnate. What there is inside of time, before about the year 2 or 3 BC, there is a stretch of time where Jesus is not incarnate. And if you ask in that time frame, does Jesus have a human form? The answer is no. He has not yet become incarnate, but that applies to your situation in time, not to his situation in heaven, where he is always incarnating in, let's say, 2 BC, and always not incarnate in before 2 BC.
Brian, thanks so much for that call. We're going to keep on moving to AJ in Quad Cities, Iowa. AJ is watching on YouTube. AJ, what is your question for Jimmy Akin? And can you be a little bit quick as we are getting close to the end of the show?
Yeah, I was just wondering what Jimmy's thoughts were on Dr. Scott Hahn's book and theory on the fourth cup.
Well, I haven't read the book, and I am familiar with the proposal. I read an article that he wrote like 30 years ago about it. I don't have strong opinions in this area. I understand the case that is made, as the basis for the proposal. My question would be, and it's based on later Jewish Passover procedures. On Passover, there's a specific ritual that's used that has these 4 cups of wine that are used. I would have sort of 2 questions, because our knowledge of this ritual has taken different forms in different ages. Like today, for example, there's no Passover lamb in it. And so it's changed forms over the ages, and we don't have first century accounts of how it was celebrated. So it's somewhat speculative in that we know later versions of the ritual had these 4 cups, but we don't have first century evidence, showing that. The other question I'd have is, could Jesus have modified it? Because Jesus modified what they did on Passover. He instituted the Eucharist as part of the meal. And so even though I understand there's a basis for this proposal, I wouldn't dismiss the idea as a possibility, but I also would point out that there are some reasons to at least question it, in that it's based on what happened in later centuries in this meal, and Jesus is also known to have made some modifications in the ritual at the Last Supper. So I would say I'm open, but not fully persuaded.
Thanks so much for that question, AJ. We are in the waning minutes of Ask Me Anything with Jimmy Akin. We're going to move along to Larry in Upland, California, listening on Sirius XM. Larry, you got to be quick because we are nearing the end of the show. Go ahead with your question for Jimmy Akin.
Yes. Jimmy, thank you. My understanding of death in the Catholic sense is the separation of the soul from the body. And I'm wondering if the event of Elijah raising the widow's son in 1 Kings, and I believe he says, Lord, please bring the soul back into the body of this child. Is that like a proof text? And am I correct on what is actually death?
Okay, well, your basic understanding of physical death as a separation of body and soul, that's correct. In terms of 1 Kings 17 being a proof text, my memory is that what Elijah says is let his life come back into him. And I'd have to look in the Hebrew to see what term is being used there. I don't know that it may not be the word for soul. And even then, the word for soul is has more than one meaning in Hebrew. So I would say I probably wouldn't appeal to that as a proof text. What I'd appeal to instead is in James 2. Because in James 2, James makes an analogy, and he says, as the body without the soul or without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead. And that statement that the body without the spirit is dead is a much clearer presentation than what we find in the example of Elisha raising the child. It's much more explicit. So I would tend to appeal to James 2.
Thanks so much for that question, Larry. That's going to do it for us today. That's all the time we have for calls. Sorry to the callers that we couldn't get to, but please do call again at a later show. We would love to get your question answered by Jimmy Akin or whoever else is on when you call. Jimmy, thanks so much for 2 great hours of Catholic Answers Live. Thanks for being a great guest for me.
My pleasure. Thanks for being a good host.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because Cy Kellett is a class act and hard to live up to, but he will be back. Again, God willing, as I say, he will be back on Monday to reclaim his spot in this chair. Thanks so much for spending your afternoon or evening with me on Catholic Answers Live. We'll be right back here, God willing, on Monday. Catholic Answers Live, out.